Question Lane. Solving problems through the process of questions and answers.
Question Lane is a podcast where the goal is to solve problems through the process of questions and answers. Today's guest is an associate professor of history and is a director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History program at the University of Florida in Gainesville. As an award-winning researcher, he has published and taught in the fields of African American history, Latino studies, the African diaspora, social movement theory, U.S. history, and the labor and document studies. Today's series of questions and answers will be centered on Area 2, education, and Area 6, politics, specifically his book, An African American History and Latinx History of the United States. Our guest today is Dr. Paul Ortiz. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Lonzo, for having me on. It's great to be here.
Perfect. What would you like to be referred to as, Dr. Ortiz, Professor Ortiz, or will Paul work?
Paul's fine.
Perfect. I'll go with Paul.
Yeah. Okay.
Is there anything you want us to know about you, Paul, before we get started?
Well, I'm a third-generation military veteran and a first-generation college graduate. And I grew up in Bremerton, Washington, and military towns on the West Coast. So that's kind of my family came from Mexico during the Mexican Revolution in 1914. And I guess it's just kind of a brief overview of where I'm from and kind of explains where my interests in history come from.
Good, understood. So before we get started into your book, I like to focus on definitions and what these words mean within the context of research. So the first word is racism. What do you mean when you use the term racism within the confines of your research?
In African American and Latinx history of the United States and in Emancipation Betrayed and other pieces I've written about racism, how I see racism is institutionalized discrimination against a group of people. And what I mean by institutionalized discrimination is state and privately sponsored expropriation of land, labor, and wealth. And oftentimes when we think of racism, we think of terms like hatred or dislikes, but I'm much more interested in the fact that the United States and the Americas, in fact, when they were quote-unquote discovered by the Europeans, the first things that the Europeans did was to begin expropriating the land and labor and wealth of indigenous people in the Americas. And when that ran low, Europeans turned to begin to exploit African labor, land, and wealth, and, of course, in initiating the transatlantic slave trade. So that's kind of how I see racism. I see racism as driven by institutions. They could be educational institutions where African-American parents are taxed the same rate as their white counterparts, and yet their monies are redistributed to white schools. And this was a practice that became very common in the Jim Crow South, and by and large, it's a practice that still continues. And so that's how I see racism, and I guess that differentiates my approach and what I've learned from people like studying W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, Cedric Robinson's work, great work on Black Marxism, C.L.R. James's great work on the Black Jacobins, the Haitian Revolution. That's kind of how I've learned to see racism as an institutionalized system of oppression.
So for the word justice, when you use the word justice, what do you mean?
Well, justice, to me, when I hear justice, I think of a few things. I think of equality, and I also think of peace. I kind of tie those all together because to have justice means that you have a system or a relationship which is based upon equality, it's based upon dignity, and it's based upon peace. And peace is an important component here because much of the last, when we talk about, 500 years of plus of oppression and resistance, much of what we fought against is institutionalized violence. And I just don't think you can have a system of justice without having, respect, for your dignity, for my dignity, and also that we live in a world of peace as opposed to a world of violence, which, as Dr. King pointed out, the U.S. is the most violent nation on the planet. Now, that unfortunately has not changed since Dr. King's assassination. So it makes it very hard for us in the United States to understand basic concepts like justice, because we're so constantly at war with people, and we promote wars, frankly, that makes justice a very difficult kind of concept. How can you have a justice in a world, where bombs are raining down on people, and where you've imposed, devastating economic sanctions on other people? Those are different forms of violence. And what I'm interested in terms of a justice-centered approach is how we, build a world based upon, living in peace with one another.
I came across a definition by an author by the name of Neely Fuller Jr., and he speaks about justice being a two-pronged approach. The first part is guaranteeing that no person is mistreated, and then the second part is guaranteeing that the people who need the most help get the most constructive help as a compensatory action. Do you think that's an accurate way of describing what justice would look like?
I agree 100% with that definition. It's an excellent definition. It reminds me of James Baldwin's critique of American society. I mean, Baldwin, was one of the greatest authors ever, and really in the modern world, period, certainly in the United States. And Baldwin, your definition is found in James, the recent film "I'm Not Your Negro" by Raoul Peck about James Baldwin. It's really a tremendous work where Baldwin says that he left the Christian church for this exact reason, because it was not practicing the golden rule. It was not practicing the idea that, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And it was not practicing anywhere near the idea of, the kind of original animating ideas of Christianity, which were all about equity, being on the side of the most oppressed and the poor. And yeah, I mean, to me, that's really part of the definition of justice. It's a big concept.
For sure. It's definitely something that we should all strive for, especially people that are non-white. We're going to get into your book here. Before I even got real deep into your book, I found the first couple of pages to be rather interesting. So one phrase that you wrote about in your book was, "My stepfather referred to incidents where I defied his authority as Mexican standoffs." For those who are unfamiliar with you, I think you spoke about this earlier. You are a non-white male, is that correct?
Yes.
Reflecting on your childhood as a Mexican American, can you briefly explain what it was like having a white stepfather?
It was hell. And years later, when I was in graduate school, I mean, I only really slowly began to realize what had happened to, both my sister and I. But thinking about growing up, when I interviewed African American parents and individuals, I worked as a graduate student. I did my PhD at Duke University, and I was working on a project called Behind the Veil, documenting African American life in the Jim Crow South. And part of this became a book called Remembering Jim Crow, which is where it's really first person testimonies about African American struggles growing up in the Jim Crow South, for really from the 1890s onwards. And one of the things that struck me in those interviews was the lengths to which African American parents in the Deep South attempted to shield their children as best as they could from white people, especially from white adults, because as a parent, your number one responsibility is to help raise your child with a sense of dignity, of self-identity, of self-respect. These were all things that the Jim Crow system, segregation, white supremacy, denied black people, especially black children, from the get-go. And so, again, black parents would try to would do anything they possibly could to minimize contacts between white adults and their black children. We also did the same thing in Mexican-American communities in the Southwest. However, having his white stepfather, all bets are off. You can't do that anymore. I mean, the wolf is in the door, so to speak. And my stepfather, it's ironic because now the more I think about him, I mean, there were some good aspects to him. I mean, he was the person who taught me how to ride a bike, how to shoot a basketball. There were some elements of him where I think he did try to be, a good role model. But on the other hand, he had hundreds of years of conditioning to see Mexican American or Mexican descent people as inferior. And I think in retrospect, trying to, get me to change my name, trying to keep me away from being Mexican American was his way of just trying to kind of assimilate me. And that's why when I hear terms like assimilation now, I think, wow, that's kind of what he was trying to do with me. And so using the term Mexican standoff, he would invoke that every time I didn't do exactly what he wanted me to do. And it's interesting, the term is it's kind of a militaristic term, and I was like, 9 years old, and he saw me in those types of terms, like when I disagreed with him or when I didn't, jump high enough or whatever, he'd get Tabasco sauce, and it was time, that they would shove it down my throat. And so there were a lot of abusive elements that kids, and since that time, Alonzo, to be honest with you, I've talked to a lot of people who grew up in similar circumstances. Our society tends to celebrate mixed race, couples, marriages, and I've known a lot of those to work out really fine. But in my case, it was a catastrophe, and And a lot of children, a lot of mixed race children have similar experiences, but we're ashamed to talk about them because we live in a society which is all about, interracial this, interracial that. And again, I'm not opposed to that. I'm totally down with that, but not when it hides systemic child abuse.
So would you consider your stepfather to be a racist based on his actions?
Oh, yes. I mean, this is a person who, I remember driving, being in the back seat of our station wagon going down the road, and whenever someone would cut him off, it was always a black or Mexican. Whenever someone got a good parking place in front of him in the mall, it was always a black or a Mexican. He and his friends talked frequently about how, blacks, or actually Mexicans in particular, took all the good jobs, so there were no more good jobs for white men. This is in the mid-1970s. But at the same time, that all Mexicans were lazy. And even as a kid, I would think, that there's kind of a contradiction there. I mean, we're taking y'all's jobs, but at the same time, we're lazy. How can that be? And then, of course, years later, this is actually one of the number one Chicano comedian routines where you're trying to figure out Anglo or white culture. How can we be both lazy and hardworking at the same time? But you see this play out in the U.S.-Mexican border today. So on the one hand, you have American businesses which have been demanding Mexican labor and Latinx labor for generations now, but at the same time, don't want to pay for it. And so they will take our labor, but then they won't grant us citizenship or equality. And it's a lot like the Jim Crow segregation white supremacy system that they shackled African Americans with after the end of slavery, which again is we're willing for you to work hard. By the way, you have a lot of resources that we have. You have land that we want access to. So we'll take that too. But on the other hand, we're not going to give you anything near equality or equal citizenship rights. And that's a dynamic that runs like a poisonous thread throughout the entire U.S. history, which a lot of people don't want to see, don't want to acknowledge, because it undermines a lot of the central myths of the United States.
So would it be logical to conclude that he married into your family to practice racism against your family?
I don't know, because I haven't talked to the man. I don't know where he is. I don't even know if he's still alive. To be honest with you, I'm not really interested even talking with him, because I realized, Alonzo, I spent the first, really 3 decades of my life just trying to come to grips with what he had done to us, trying to recover my name, first of all, which I talked about briefly in the book, trying to recover a sense of dignity. I developed a terrible speech impediment, and, trying to kind of recover from that. At the end of that process, I realized, I'm not really interested in talking with a person, and this might be a deficit on my part. Maybe I should have sought him out. Maybe I should, try to find out if he's alive today. But I'm just too busy, working with students. A lot of my students, to be honest with you, are going through similar problems today. And so I have to spend my time, doing those types of things. But whether he, planned to do this, I don't know. But it gets back to the way you'd asked me earlier about my definition of racism. I don't think he had to plan to do it. I think that he kind of was almost programmed to do it, because that's how, if you look at what Ibram Kendi and others have written even more recently about racism, once it becomes institutionalized, it takes an active will to break out of the system. And that's where we're at now. I mean, that's why James Baldwin grew increasingly impatient with people towards the end of his life, because, everyone wanted to go to James Baldwin for a dispensation or a way out. Mr. Baldwin, don't you think things are getting better for the Negro? Was a question that he constantly, and finally he turned it back. He turned it back on people. He said, "You're asking the wrong question. The question is, what's the state of the civilization?" And the question, and the answer to that is pretty bad. Pretty poor. And that's the reason you're asking me that. He would say to people, Baldwin would say, that's the reason you're asking me this question, only relating to the situation of black people, because you don't want to address the question about how piss poor your own civilization is right now at this point. He was referring to Western civilization.
So the word Latinx, what does the word Latinx mean?
It's a great term. And, when I was growing up, we referred, you still heard a lot Mexican American, Mexicano, Spanish speaking. The term Chicano really had just come into effect as a positive term of identity for people of Mexican descent. And that came about because of movement building, because people in the farm worker movement, in the student movement, the Brown Power movement started using the term Chicano. And so when I was a kid growing up, that term was pretty popular. And then the idea behind the term Latino or Latina was that, hey, let's think about ourselves not just as Mexicans, not just as Dominicans, not just as Puerto Ricans, or so on and so forth, but let's think of what our commonalities are, and we come from colonized nations by and large, and so the term Latino is kind of a pan kind of term. It's a joining term, if you will. Latinx is a term that, and it's kind of generational, and I think of it as a corollary to, looking back in history to a time when when African Americans, the term color, the term black, the term, Afro-American was used. And over time, the terms change, because we're trying to figure out where we are in this kind of strange land, at American Babylon. And for Latinos, Latinx is very popular among especially, younger brothers and sisters. It's a term. Spanish, of course, is a gendered language. It's a Romance language. It's a European-based language. And so when we would use Latino, we would say, well, hey, wait a minute, what about women too? So Latina so sometimes you'd see Latina /O to denote, men and women. But at the same time, what about trans people? What about, transgendered brothers and sisters? And so the idea behind Latinx is let's get beyond, or let's break through the gender binary. And if we're really going to be inclusive, then let's be inclusive. But you have to do that at the level of language. And so hence Latinx. And when I was coming up with the title for the book, by the way, that's the title that my students really picked. People in their late teens and early 20s, they said, you're talking about equality and justice and inclusivity. You really have to kind of put your title where your rhetoric is. So you will see Latinx, is becoming increasingly popular, but there's also debates. Just as there was debate when people in the African American community started using the term Black. I have elders who don't like the term Latin. I have elders who don't like the term Latino because they think that it's a colonized term. They're like, well, why would you use that, Paul? You should use Chicano. But I'm in Florida now. I'm on the East Coast, and so there's a lot of people. A lot of my students are Cuban American, or Haitian American, and I have Haitian American students who say, hey, we're Latinx people too. And so it's really a thriving debate. And you will hear people, we write articles about it. We do blog posts, we have debates. I've been on many debates where, people are like, what is this X thing, But also we learned a lot from, Latino people have always learned a lot in terms of movement building from African-American civil rights, Black Power, anti-colonial movements. And in the 60s, the term Chicanx became very popular, Chicano with an X at the end of it, because the idea was we don't really have a home here, where this place was not built for us. And so the X meant something a little different in the 60s, but I think now we're finding that we're still debating terms. But that's kind of a long, I apologize for the kind of long response to your very concise question.
No worries. I appreciate the explanation. When I think about the power dynamic between, as you described, Latinx people or African American people, I think about the confusion that creates with, as you just described in your diatribe, how there's a lot of confusion about who's considered Latinx or who's considered to be a part of a movement. I think a more accurate way of describing this is looking at the power imbalance that non-white people in general face, where white people are at the top and everybody else is at the bottom. So the collective group of Latinx and Black people, do you think it'll be an accurate way of describing those people as just non-white?
Well, that's a really good question. I'm not sure. And also, one of the challenges in writing the book was, and in teaching about this and also building movements, is we realize in states like California and Florida that those boundaries don't even quite describe who we are as a people. So, for example, there's a lot of Afro-Latinos, and there's Afro-Latino organizations, all throughout the Americas. There are Latinos, some of whom who actually define themselves as white. It's a minority, but it's a pretty big minority, especially in states like Florida. And there are people who are encouraging us to really break through those boundaries. And so, and say, for example, I have a lot of students who are involved in movements, the Dream Defenders in Florida, Black Lives Matter, and labor union organizing, especially among, like, say, home healthcare workers, service workers, where, the term people, we used to use the term people of color, but to be honest, we dominate those fields. Those are booming areas, healthcare, service work, and so how do you refer to people in those categories? To me, you always go to the person or to the group and say, well, how should I refer to you as? Like, when we started the interview, you asked me, how do I refer to be referred to, professor, doctor, Paul, and we try to do that, I think, on on a consistent basis. It's not always possible. I'm not sure how I feel about the term non-white, though. I mean, I'd have to think more about that, because it's kind of like it's almost like a negative term. I mean, I know you didn't mean it negatively, but it's like
I can explain
white.
if you want.
Okay, sure, yeah.
Well, I use the term non-white because, like I said earlier, there's a power imbalance between white people and black people and Latin people, Asian people, etc. And with that confusion in terms of how we fit within the society in all areas of people activity, it could create a lot of bickering and fighting internally instead of focusing on our places within the society and how we're viewed. If there was an encompassing term such as non-white, it'll put the focus not necessarily on us, because there's obviously differences, but the focus will be on the people that have the power and what needs to be done to replace the system of racism with the system of justice, something that's going to compensate for the people who've been mistreated. Like you talked about black people with redlining or mass incarceration or slavery. Same thing could be said about Mexican Americans who are not being able to get asylum, or Salvadorians, or Hondurans. The focus should be focused on what's the most important race in this society. I would say that it's white, and that's the issue that is the problem that not only black people deal with, but I would say Latin Americans deal with, Central Americans deal with, just that lack of power in all areas, and that could be in economics, education, politics, religion, etc. So that's why I like to use the word non-white, because it's one that puts the focus not on us, but on the people who have the power and what needs to be done to create a more just society.
That makes perfect sense. I mean, when you break it down that way, that makes excellent sense, because it does get us thinking back about issues of power. And this has been the thing that I've been frustrated with in recent years. We often forget you have to talk about power, right? And so, I mean, just yesterday, apparently the governor of Texas, a couple of my students in Texas sent me these amazing, really shocking and disturbing statements that the governor of Texas, I think his name is Abbott, he was doing a fundraiser of some kind, and he was raising money from his constituents and people in Texas by talking about what a tragedy it is that Texas has to pay for the education of so-called illegal immigrants. And he was also, the governor of Texas was also saying that he is pledged to defend Texas from these people, right? So when I look at that, I think this guy has declared war on us. And when you think about who so-called illegal immigrants are, it isn't just Mexicans, it isn't just Latinos, it's people from Africa, it's people from Asia, and we live in a society where some of the white people at the top of the society, this guy's a governor of one of the biggest states in the country, have literally declared war on us. And that's how my students, or my former students, responded to this immediately, was, wow, this guy has just declared open season. And I mean, in the same just weeks after the mass murder in El Paso, which was created because of the system that we have, as you're pointing out to, which values white life above all other lives and says, if you're not white, you're an invader, you're not wanted here, you're not welcome. And that's exactly the things that motivated this mass murderer in El Paso. He was looking for us, people like us. And I think if he would have found, Asian Americans, I think if he would have found, African immigrants, I think he would have been felt just as satisfied in terms of committing these murders, as he would have if he had just gunned down only Mexican people or Mexican American people. Hopefully that makes sense. But I'm really shocked now. Every day I kind of wake up and see the institutionalized racism. I mean, there was a period of time when you weren't supposed to say stuff like this. We had the so-called post-racial era, but now it's just kind of back to square one.
Yeah, the mask has been revealed. So you wrote about Alexis de Tocqueville, I believe that's how do you pronounce his name?
Oh yes, Alexis de Tocqueville, or
Yes.
in kind of angle of de Tocqueville's fine, yeah.
Yeah, and you also wrote about Jose Marti as well. Can you talk about the importance of writing and researching history and presenting that history from the perspective of Latin Americans, Central Americans, and African Americans?
Well, it's very important because what I'm trying to do, the argument I'm trying to make, Alonzo, is that people today, whether they're liberals or people on the left, a lot of people, and even some, conservatives and mainstream people are disturbed by what they see as this reemergence of white nationalism. It's undeniable now. It's in everyday newspapers. It's in our schools. It's in our financial institutions. I just took my students on a fieldwork study. I direct the UF oral history program, and we were in a town where, African American retirees who have a good amount of resources in terms of retirement funds, pension funds set up, and 401ks, are not even allowed to purchase houses, condominiums in certain parts of the towns they live in, because they're told, we're still told in states like Florida, this is not where black people live. This is not where Hispanic people live. This is where y'all live, right? And so, we can't just talk about past discrimination. We talk about redlining. That still is occurring literally. And I guess one of the things that I'm trying to do with African American Latinx history in the United States is to say that if you don't like white nationalism, but you only teach that in your textbooks, then you're going to continue to get white nationalism. And what I mean by this, Alonzo, is that when I was a kid, when I was in kindergarten and first and second and third grade, our teachers and adults used to organize musicals where they would dress us up as Alexander Hamilton, as George Washington, as Ben Franklin, so on and so forth. And we would recite lines. I'm sure we dance, and all these things. But again, the idea was assimilation. The idea was that we, people of color, as they sometimes referred to us back then, we're the ones that have to learn Alexander Hamilton. We're the ones that have to learn George Washington. But white people don't have to learn anything about, you mentioned Jose Marti. They don't have to learn anything about the Mexican War of Independence. They don't have to learn anything about the Haitian Revolution. It's all about, we have to assimilate to their white nationalist culture. And I'm sorry to say that we haven't really progressed, because now, instead of just having children dress up like Alexander Hamilton and dance and sing, we have adults do the same thing. And it's the Hamilton musical in New York. And a lot of my white colleagues don't like me saying this, but that's a white nationalist production. Why couldn't we have a major production based upon the life of, say, Toussaint Louverture, the great revolutionary leader in Haiti? Why couldn't we have a major production based upon the life of Harriet Tubman, a real freedom fighter? And instead, we still do the same thing over and over again. Alonzo, I just finished reviewing the newest textbook in U.S. history, almost 800 pages. And I guess that there's an advance there because it does talk about slavery and the importance of slavery in the early American Republic. But again, it's James Madison, it's Monroe, it's Washington, it's the same cast of characters, and we're supposed to be grateful to them for everything we have today. And so what my work, and I'm simply drawing from earlier works like Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's Indigenous Peoples, History of the United States, Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. What I'm trying to say is that look to Mexico. What has Mexico provided and offered and taught the United States from day one? And so chapter 1 in my new book centers the Haitian Revolution and the struggle against slavery in the United States. Chapter 2 talks about the Mexican War of Independence and the central character and nature and the fact that Mexico abolishes slavery and what that, way before the U.S. does, and how that impacts U.S. history from day one. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to, do my part in saying if we don't like white nationalism, then we have to develop a new type of history that stops privileging white nationalism. I mean, you and I were not meant to be citizens of this republic. We were not meant to have basic rights to decide where we wanted to live. Certainly not. We were not expected or not supposed to have anything near voting rights by the founding fathers. So how do we get those things? We got those things through the struggles of our ancestors. They fought, they died, they bled, they suffered. And as long as you have a U.S. history that denies those sufferings, that silences those sufferings, that's a white nationalist history at the baseline. And so that's what I'm trying to do in my book, is to break out of that, and especially for younger people, because I mentioned earlier, as parents, what we're trying to do is to help our children develop a sense of dignity. And you can't do that if you tell the children, your people have no history. But that's the situation that we're in today, by and large.
I totally agree. What was the UFWOC, and what was their call to action following the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King?
So the UFWC was the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee and became the United Farm Workers Union. And a lot of your listeners will be familiar with Cesar Chavez or Dolores Huerta. They were the co-founders of the union. And when the union was in the middle of the Great Boycott, which lasted from 1965 to 1970, in the middle of that struggle, Cesar Chavez and Martin Luther King Jr. had, corresponded with each other. Unfortunately, tragically, they were never able to actually sit down and talk one-on-one. Cesar was mainly working in California in the Southwest, and Dr. King was working in the Poor People's Campaign, in Memphis, in Atlanta, and in the Southeast. But they shared, telegrams, communications. Dr. King was a strong supporter of the United Farm Workers' Great Boycott. And actually, a lot of the activists in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Congress of Racial Equality, Black Panthers, other organizations were very strong supporters of the Great Boycott. But when Dr. King was assassinated, the United Farm Workers Union had a publication, and they dedicated an entire issue of that print publication, which is in English and Spanish, to pay homage to the life of Dr. King. And the title page of that remarkable journal was titled "Killed Helping Workers Trying to Organize." And what the United Farm Worker Union was trying to say was that Dr. King, lived and died defending the rights of working class people. And in the background of the cover page of the journal is a picture of Dr. King in the foreground, and in the background you see black men who have these picket signs that say "I am a man," and that was a iconic picket sign that was used during the Memphis sanitation workers strike, which is the struggle in which Dr. King lost his, was assassinated in. So the farm worker movement really learned a lot of lessons from the African American Civil Rights Movement, also from the Black Power movement, also the Young Lords and other groups like that, and really try to emphasize the connections between those different struggles.
So do you think the impact has been felt in terms of what he suggests, what the magazine suggested that we do to honor Dr. King in terms of strengthening solidarity and basically organizing workers? Do you think that movement has been solidified and expanded correctly?
Well, I see it here and there. I mean, I mentioned earlier, Alonzo, the work the Dream Defenders have been doing in Florida, and Black Lives Matter, some of the really progressive labor union work that's been happening. And some places, yes. But by and large, I would have to say, no, we still have a long way to go. In that publication that you mentioned, the United Farm Worker publication, the takeaway from that was here's what we owe Dr. King. We've got to get moving. We've got to get organized. On the level of education, the United Farm Workers was sponsoring schools for the children of strikers, because during the grape boycott and the big strikes against the grape growers, a lot of the Mexican-American kids would just get kicked out of school, or schools would just shut down. And so the union had to develop alternative schools. And what we know from these schools is that the curriculum on the level of history was to teach Mexican history and Black history. And we have their surviving lesson plans that talk about how, I mean, these were K through 6 students, okay? We're not even talking about college or high school. But those students, the K through 6 students, were learning lessons about people like Emiliano Zapata, like the Mexican Revolution, where it came from. But they also were learning about the life of Malcolm X, about the work of Angela Davis. And we know this. We don't have all the lesson plans, but we do have outlines, and so these are the types of lessons kids were learning. So you can ask, I'll ask you the question: when you were growing up in schools, how much did you learn about Angela Davis?
Not until college.
Right, and see, that's where we're coming up short. And when I watch a film like I'm Not Your Negro about the life of James Baldwin, it's a wake-up call, why aren't children, I mean, I'll give you another anecdote. In 2014, I was asked to come to a school in Southern California to talk to a group of high school students, 99% of whom were Mexican-American, Chicano students in Los Angeles, because these students had started reading James Baldwin on their own. His works had not been assigned to them. These were just high school kids, and they just started reading Baldwin. And a teacher called me and said, would you be willing to come to Los Angeles to sit and talk to these students, right? And so I went down there. One of my former PhD students went with me. On our way over there, Alonzo, we were actually disinvited from the high school. And the reason was that the principal or the superintendent or someone got word that we were doing this event, checked into James Baldwin, and thought, and basically made the decision, wow, James Baldwin was too radical for our high school kids to learn about. And so we actually got disinvited from this high school. But that was okay, because we ended up meeting with the school kids in another location, away from the high school. And I was just amazed, because this is a case where high school kids are taking control of their own educational destiny. And the inspiring thing is that if you think of the 60s, where did ethnic studies come from? It's Black college students, Asian American college students, Chicano college students demanding a new kind of curriculum. And the same thing in the high school level. We just celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Chicano blowouts or Chicano walkouts, where high school kids demanded that something be taught about their parents and their histories, their languages, their cultures in the schools, which were all set up for assimilation. In other words, brown people and Black people have to learn to act white in order to be successful. But we've seen the dead end character, and we've seen the results of that assimilationist philosophy, and I mean, history used to be seen as an elective, but after Charlottesville, after Charleston, after El Paso, we understand now history is a matter of life or death. So if we can continue teaching people that only white lives matter, we can continue teaching people that only white history matters, but then what happens is that, you have these terrible things like El Paso.
Okay. Do you believe that if white people or white students were more aware of Vicente Guerrero or Mexico being the first fully realized social democracy, do you think that they would stop practicing racism?
I don't think they would stop practicing racism altogether, but I think it would be a great step forward, because then they would realize that people other than U.S. Americans have developed advanced civilizations. You mentioned social democracy. Whenever I talk, I encourage people. Well, I start by asking people, how much of the Mexican Constitution have you ever read or understood? And I get a lot of blank looks. And what I'm trying to get across is, in the U.S., we have a problem with military launching wars, right? Everyone agrees at this moment that we launch too many wars. And so I tell people, if you want to get at that problem, look at Mexican history. Mexico has a constitution which values non-intervention as a constitutional philosophy. Let's study that. Where did it come from? And if you want to look at a constitution which talked about the equality of women and men, look at the Mexican Constitution. It actually has that in its foundation. And so, yes, I think that if white Americans were taught to understand that there's these incredible traditions of freedom and democracy in cultures and in societies in places like, certainly in the continent of Africa, in Latin America, that long preceded European conquest, if white people were taught those things, they'd have a much greater appreciation for ideas like justice or equality, where you and I started this interview. If not, if they're only taught that civilization starts in Europe, then we're doomed. Then we won't even survive as a species, because that's a white supremacist philosophy. That's the same philosophy which gave us World War I, which gave us World War II, and which will actually obliterate the world, because it only values one part of the world over the entire rest of the world.
Speaking on white people, it being a good step for them to know about some of this non-white history, an excerpt from your book, you wrote, "Slave conspirators in Virginia acted in the expectation that poor white artisans would join them in rising against the upper class. After all, didn't slaves and working class whites share the same common oppressor?" Who do you think was more confused about the system of racism, what it is and how it works during slavery? White people or the non-white people?
Well, white people, without question. And the slave revolt that you're referring to, the expectation among some of the African American leaders was they were basing their expectation that they could organize some of the poor whites based in part on what poor whites were saying about slavery, which was that slavery was a system designed to uphold the power of rich white people. And that's what Denmark Vesey and other African Americans who were organizing slave revolts felt and believed and hoped. When you're organizing a revolution, there has to be a certain element of hope in it. You can't predict what's going to happen, but based on what some white people were saying about slavery in the late 1700s and early 1800s, the idea that some white people would join a slave revolt was not as absurd as it seems now. But unfortunately, too many white people defaulted to defend the system of slavery, and we kind of know the end of the story. But if you want to move that story further, just about 50 or 60 years, during the American Civil War, about 200,000 white Southerners actually fought for the Union Army, and because slavery was a class system of racial oppression. We can't forget that. I mean, that's what W.E. Du Bois taught us. And it oppressed white people as well. I mean, certainly not on the same level, but it was something that Du Bois and others pointed out.
So who do you think will be more confused about racism, the system, and how it works today? Non-white people or white people?
Well, white people, without a doubt. I mean, you see this confusion even after Donald Trump is elected. The mainstream media institutions are run by white elites, and they have, it took them months and even years, and many even now are still debating, well, is Donald Trump a racist? Does he just say racist things? And so there's that, you see that confusion. Sometimes I don't know whether to laugh or to cry. But I'm like, well, what does the man have to do in addition to what he has already done on the level of governance for you to understand that he is a racist? And so, the fact that people are arguing and debating over this demonstrates tremendous confusion, again, at the top of the society.
And when I use the word confusion, I'm envisioning, who should be at the top of society and society's rungs, and who should be in charge. That's really what I'm thinking about when I use the word confusion. And when I think about racism, I don't really see white people then or now being confused about racism in terms of who should be at the top. I think it's evident, and they think white people should be at the top and non-white people should be at the bottom, just simply based on how economics, how the wealth gap is calcifying and being expanded further and further.
Right.
All of these mass terror attacks, people not being convicted for killing non-white people in the streets. As a matter of fact, it took till this week just for the killer of Eric Garner in New York, Daniel Pantaleo, just to get fired.
Right.
No talks of him getting arrested and charged with murder, but just now he's getting fired. So I wouldn't say that they're confused necessarily about the power dynamic and who should be at the top. I think it's just how you should treat non-white people. Should you be open with the racism and yelling at them and calling them names, or should you be more refined with it and just gentrify them out of their areas and not allow them to be in the country, but just do it in a more refined way? Do you think that's a logical approach to think about when you think about the confusion between white people and non-white people?
I agree with your analysis, because you have to look at the basic institutions of the society, when you ask these types of questions. And so when you look at the level of neighborhoods, the level of intense racial segregation, which at this point is enforced, it has to be enforced. Right? It's a kind of 21st century. I mean, I even think some of the terms we use just don't describe the reality. So we use a term like gentrification, but I think we should be using the terms like ghettoization and resegregation. I mean, you have again, we just came off this 1-week field study. We're in different towns. I'm talking about, working with students, and having people tell us point blank, black people are not allowed to even purchase a home in this part of the city or the town. And when you have that kind of a system, that, there's nothing accidental about it. There's nothing confusing about it. I think the confusion comes by, again, going back to the history. We have a U.S. history which people are taught from the very beginning, from kindergarten. And you remember the example I gave you about, children, being dressed up like Alexander Hamilton and having to give these speeches. So the confusion comes in where people are taught that their system in the United States is a free and democratic system based upon respect for, the rights of others. But when you grow up in the society and you realize, well, it's not based on that, it's based on something else, that's where I think people can be legitimately confused. And I wouldn't blame a white sixth grader for being confused about that kind of, about what's happening in the society. It's our job as educators to teach children what's going wrong in the society. And that's exactly what's not happening right now. I mean, I base this on what my former students who are now elementary or secondary teachers are telling me, and they tell me things like, here's one example, Alonzo. So I have a lot of former students who are teachers in different Florida school districts. And what they tell me is that during the weeks that their curriculum says that they're going to teach something about the civil rights movement, what they're talking about is the very mainstream civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. That's the week where a lot of white parents actually sign waivers to allow their children to miss school or to skip those lessons or to stay home.
That's exhibit number 3.
Exactly.
That's exhibit number 3.
Yeah, exactly. And so that, and I don't think that's unique to Florida. I mean, I'm more familiar with Florida because I have a lot of former students that teach in Florida. But on the other hand, if you saw some of the lesson plans that some of our school districts, both charter schools but also public schools have about things like slavery, I mean, you would weep. I mean, I've cried when I've seen these because I had a student come in 2 years ago, and she showed me the lesson plan that she was supposed to be implementing in her class about slavery for, I think it was middle school kids. And here's what it said. It said that slavery wasn't that bad a system. Most masters treated their slaves well because they're property. And, if a person is property, obviously they're going to be treated better. But then the capstone was, slaves and masters worked together to build a better Florida. And I'm quoting directly now. And I had a grad student who was there with me looking at this curriculum, and he couldn't believe it. He was just so stunned. And I was just saddened because I'm like, he asked me, aren't you upset? And I said, yeah, I'm upset, but I'm not surprised. But the kids deserve better than that. Damn, it's just unbelievable.
I would definitely love to see a copy of that or be directed to where that is on the internet so I could review that. But as I was saying, that's exhibit 3. I mean, we just spoke about you traveling to California to help out some kids understand the work of James Baldwin. We talked about Governor Abbott in Texas. And then this middle school example here in Florida where this is not the governor this time. This is not the school system this time. This is parents this time of white students excusing their kids from school. So this is when I talk about the confusion aspect. I don't believe they're confused, whether it's on the power, the very tops of power in terms of who's controlling the educational system, or just the average run-of-the-mill white family. I believe that they're dedicated to maintaining this system, and some are more, like I said before, unrefined in their approach, where they want to be overt with it, and some want to be more refined. So that's why it's important that the listeners read books like your book and other people's research in terms of talking about this history from our perspective and bringing that to the forefront.
Yeah, well, and I agree 100%. And I want to lift up again, my sister in struggle, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, In Indigenous People's History of the United States, because that is a fundamental element of racial oppression, and understanding the battle against oppression begins, one part of this begins in understanding, the roots of slavery, the development of capitalism and racism. And but we often forget how so much of this was also based upon the theft and enslavement of the European theft and enslavement of indigenous peoples. And I think if we gain an understanding about how oppression and resistance are intertwined, are connected, I mean, that's why I wrote African American Latinx History of the United States, is, when I go back and thought about the oppression that I experienced at the hands of my stepfather, why did he always juxtapose or connect blacks and Mexicans, constantly, intertwined? Because there's a fear there. There's a fear that, wow, if those people really got together and organized and demanded changes, then the system of white supremacy goes down the drain. Remember what Malcolm X said when Malcolm came back from his tour of going to certain African nations, talking to leaders of the anti-colonial movement. He came back to the United States and he said, stop talking about our people. He was talking about black people initially. Stop talking about our people as minorities. He said, when you start traveling throughout the world, you realize we're the majority. And it's in this country that they try to brainwash us into thinking that we're like some small, tiny fragment, interest group. But if you can think globally, and you can think of the connections between the struggles of the farm worker movement, the Black Power movement, the anti-colonial movement, so on and so forth, then you're talking about building a real global struggle. I mean, we saw this emerge. When I was a college student, the anti-apartheid movement was just this remarkable reminder about the connectivity of oppressions, but also the connections between resistance movements.
Couldn't have said it any better. The last topic I want to talk about here is reparations. So in your piece you wrote, in 1830, the aggregate value of the United States slaves was about $577 million. The economic value of these slaves would be $9.84 trillion in today's revenue. Do you think that it's logical that American descendants of slaves would be due for reparations?
Yes. I mean, I talk in the conclusion of the book, based upon that, the value, the things stolen, the things that white people, people of European descent stole from African Americans continue to steal from African Americans. I think the key here, Alonzo, is continue. Some of my colleagues who were, and elders who did amazing work on reparations in the 1960s and 70s, the only thing that I have to add to that is that I want us to look at that so-called Jim Crow period, between the end of slavery to now, to thinking about all of the things that you mentioned earlier, kind of, real estate interests, land interests, employers have stolen from black people. And based upon that, let's put together a plan for reparations. Now, Dr. William Darity at Duke University, I would highly advise, if you haven't had a chance to talk with him, Dr. Darity has put together a really amazing, pretty comprehensive plan that addresses both reparations, but also economic inequality in general. And so his idea, and he can speak for himself. He's an economist. It's a very complicated project, but he's laid it out, and he's presented this in research papers. And I mean, here's another anecdote. So one of the places that we went to in this field project was Elaine, Arkansas. And some of your listeners will be familiar with the Elaine race riot, or we call it the Elaine Massacre, which happened in 1919, which involved white plantation owners using the federal government to massacre black farmers. Excuse me. And there were approximately 240 black farmers or more who were actually murdered, many by federal troops and so-called law enforcement. At the end of that massacre, there's a process of white land interests coming in and taking the land that was once owned by black farmers. And this is a process you see all across the country. When you hear the term race riot, and it happens in a rural area or even urban area like, say, Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1921, it involves the white theft of black businesses, of black property, of black assets, over and over and over again. And this is often masked under the term race riot or the term mob, none of which is really quite accurate, is it? And so I think that a program of reparations has to be based upon the whole history. Slavery is certainly fundamental, the foundation, but let's not stop the clock at 1865, and let's think about the type, the assets, the land, the labor, which was stolen from black people. And I also want us to think about, and I talked about this in African American Latinx history of the United States, let's think about the land that was stolen from Mexican Americans by groups like the Texas Rangers, the great, Texas landowners in the Southwest. But let's not forget also what was stolen from indigenous people. And when we remember when we combine our interests, as people historically oppressed, to me, then we begin to really put together an exciting new kind of social movement, which is saying that it's not a zero-sum game. because we can't have a society where some people are desperately impoverished, because then that society becomes a society based upon fear. And again, I think that's what James Baldwin was talking about. Baldwin was saying white people do these crazy things because they've created a society based upon fear. You know, we have a foreign policy right now, which is based upon fear of the other. But part of the fear is based upon the fact that you've kept the other impoverished. You've kept the other disenfranchised. You've kept the other, you've stolen the other's, you know, property and land. I mean, my grandfather lost his house in Houston, Texas, because the white folks wanted to put a interstate through a Chicano neighborhood. And in fact, they did that. And so Mexican-American businesses and homeowners lost their property, lost their land. And that's what we've been fighting and grappling with for centuries in the society. And so the concept of reparations is based in any fundamental idea of justice. You know, whether you're a capitalist or a socialist or whatever, I don't see how you can be opposed to reparations.
I appreciate you bringing in examples. Well, I definitely want to get in an interview with Dr. Darity because I definitely have questions about his plan as well. But I appreciate you bringing in the most recent example you did about your father lost his house because of an interstate being built in his former neighborhood. I just recently
grandfather. Yeah.
I recently spoke to Dr. James Jennings. He's a retired professor out of Tufts University, and we spoke about how these interstates were built in a lot of these black communities throughout the country. And I'm originally from Miami, and in Miami they built the interstate right through Overtown and kind of pushed a lot of residents from Overtown down into North Miami and what would be Miami Gardens of nowadays. But the politicians that's running for the Democratic nomination, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, those are the top three right now, and Joe Biden as well. If a politician says that with all the information we've spoken about today, redlining and interstate being built in communities and slavery, etc., if they are not for reparations, what do you think that means in terms of their dedication to creating a just society for these non-white people?
Well, if they're not for reparations, then they're not really living up to the creeds that they espouse. Now, I'm thinking of Senators Warren and Sanders, who both see themselves as people heavily invested in ideas of economic justice. Kamala Harris also. Now, Joe Biden, I might put him in a different category because I don't think he's ever made those types of commitments, right? But certainly the other three candidates, if they came out and said, based upon a careful study of the problems that we face today and the impact of history upon those problems, and they said that they were opposed to reparations, I mean, I wouldn't be able to support their candidacies. I mean, actually, that's not a good answer. I mean, I just gave you a personal answer, but trying to be objective about it, I mean, I would just kind of say, why? I mean, what have we failed to explain to you clearly? I mean, the statistic about the amount of wealth that African American slave labor contributed to this country, by now that is unassailable. That's not even controversial anymore. But the problem is on an educational level. In the schools, people are still allowed to dodge that issue. You talked earlier about the concept of what was the concept you mentioned, Alonzo? Was confusion, I think?
Yes, racial confusion.
Okay, so James Baldwin used the term of innocence. And what he meant by this is that white people were not innocent, but that they created a society which allowed them to really pretend they were innocent of everything because they had not ever been, the American exceptionalism, that idea allows them to dodge responsibility for anything. because, the U.S. is the greatest country on earth. But if you think of, even a conservative concept like respect for property, let's break that down for a moment. Let's say you have a society which you say is based upon respect for private property. But then, for hundreds of years, you allow law enforcement and vigilante groups like the Ku Klux Klan to steal land from black farmers and from Mexican-American farmers. How much do you really respect private property? If you have a system where you go into a Mexican-American or African-American community in Richmond, Virginia in the 1960s, and you want to build an interstate and you decide, hey, we're going to put it through the black community because they have less political power, how much do you really respect private property? So you respect some people's private property, but not other people's private property. And so I even question my capitalist, friends who say they're capitalists. I say, you don't have a society that respects private property. You respect some people's property, but then not others. Look at school privatization in Florida or even in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. How many generations of black parents struggled to build these schools, to build up these property values, the physical plant, the land, the improvements, and then you're going to invite private corporations to come in and take those schools over? That's not respect for private property. That's expropriation. That's just as much expropriation as when you went in and stole our small farms in East Texas in the 1920s so that you could combine and have these big Anglo ranches. So I apologize because I'm obviously rambling now. I don't even remember what your original question was, but the idea that you could have a society now that doesn't want to deal with issues like reparations, that's another example of either confusion, innocence, exceptionalism, I don't know, but certainly avoidance.
Well, and I'll just try to wrap it up. Are you good for another 10 minutes?
Sure.
Okay. I'm asking this because when we look at the Democratic Party, non-white people, especially black people, have been staunch supporters of the Democrats in overwhelming numbers. And when I think about the candidates, like I talked about earlier, the only one who seems to even support not just the study, because recently this whole concept of, I support HB 40, I support the study of reparations, not necessarily the budgeting and allocating some money towards reparations, just the study of it when there's tons of books out there. But the only person who said that they have a budget and are prepared to introduce that budget for reparations if they get elected is Marianne Williamson. And her estimation of how much it would take would be, I think, in a range of $200 to $400 billion over the course of 10 years, which is a laughably low amount when you consider just what I talked about earlier with the slaves being worth $577 million, and in 2014 they were worth $9.84 trillion. So that in and of itself is a low estimate, but I'm pretty sure the people in the comments will tell me if I'm wrong about Bernie Sanders. But I recall Bernie Sanders specifically saying he's not for giving reparations to black people. Now, he might be for the study of it, as he recently talked about it. And Elizabeth Warren, she has like a redlining plan, a plan to kind of correct some of the injustices that would due to redlining. But as far as reparations, Marianne Williamson is the only one that I heard that is for it in practice, not just a moral argument. Do you think that's something that non-white people should think about in terms of voting in 2020?
Oh, most definitely. I think a lot of people and a lot of the students I work with are very strong, and students of color are very strong supporters of Senator Sanders. But I will be sharing with them based upon what you've told me. You've educated me right here, because now I'm thinking about Bernie Sanders just released a $16.2 trillion plan to deal with global climate change. That's correct, right? I'm not making that up.
No, climate change is correct. Correct.
Yeah. Okay. So here's the thing. I agree 100%. I mean, global climate change, we've got to put a lot of resources into it because otherwise we won't have a planet, and I can tell you as a historian how that came about in terms of, but see, global climate change is driven by the same evil forces in society that created slavery, that created Jim Crow, that created the expropriation of land from Native American people in the 1400s and 1500s. Ecocide is the end result of all these systems of oppression, which have stolen so much from people, and which have abused the land, and it created a society where we don't see the earth as a place to treasure, but we see the earth as a place to exploit. I don't see you as a fellow brother, a fellow human being. I see you as someone who, what can I get out of him? Your gain is my loss. That kind of zero-sum mentality. So on the one hand, I do agree with the idea. Hey, put 16 trillion into global climate change. To me, seems like a lowball estimate. I mean, that seems like you're getting off kind of cheap. But if you can put that much money into fighting global climate change, then again, the question is, what are you going to put into reparations? Because reparations is at the foundation of what's gone, that the exploitation of African American people is at the foundation of the same forces which create the need to deal with global climate change. I mean, hopefully I'm making some sense there.
No, absolutely. I hope I get to ask Bernie that one day.
Right. Well, but see, I mean, here's the thing. Again, I would just ask, and I'm happy to do this, and I can report back to you, because some of my students are very excited about, Bernie Sanders. Some of my students are very excited about Kamala Harris, others about Elizabeth Warren, and I wish I could say the same thing about some of the others you mentioned, but those three come to mind, and we have the right to ask them where they stand on all of these issues. But again, thinking out loud, if you are concerned about global climate change, then understand that the slave labor camp or the plantation is at the center of what wrecks the environment in the Americas in the 1500s, because you're talking about a system of agriculture that, the sugar plantation, the tobacco plantation, the indigo plantation, which sets the stage for ecocide, the wiping out of forests, the wiping out of the lungs of the earth, what's happening in the Amazon today, the exploitation of indigenous peoples. And so I don't see how you can address global climate change unless you address the issue of reparations.
Well, I learned a lot today, Dr. Ortiz, and I hope the listeners find value in what you said and decide to research your work and think about some of the things that we talked about today. Is there anything else you want to talk about in terms of upcoming work or academic papers or books that might be potentially out soon?
Well, I just want to thank you for the incredible work that you're doing, Alonzo. And I do have, at the risk of self-promoting, I am going to be giving a couple talks coming up in Florida. And I will be at Fort Lauderdale actually next Thursday evening at 7:30, the Black Elks Lodge. And I'll be talking about the book Emancipation Betrayed, and also the book we've been talking about today, African American and Latinx History of the United States. And the sponsoring group is called Broward County People of Color. And so I'll be there, like I said, in Fort Lauderdale next Thursday. And then the following week, or early September, I'll actually be taking part in the Race and Retrospective lecture down at Miami Beach. And that's going to be September 5th through 7th. I'll be giving talks in Miami. So I would love to be able to interact with you and your listeners more kind of one-on-one. And again, I just want to commend you for this great educational program that you've created for us.
Oh, perfect. Do you have any social media or any books that you want to promote before we leave?
Well, I just think, I'm encouraging people to read African American Latinx history of the United States. I'm happy to also report to you that there is now a teacher's guide for African American and Latinx history of the United States, and the teacher's guide was developed for high school. You can even use the book at middle school. I've done workshops with a lot of school districts now. We're trying to develop a new kind of history curriculum, where Black and brown children feel a sense of pride, a sense of dignity, understand what their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and ancestors have done to build this country, to create the wealth of this country that has not been shared equally. But, unless you understand where that wealth comes from, you can't even begin to address the issues that are facing us now. And so I just encourage people, and the other thing I encourage people to do is read these things in groups. Not just my book. Read Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Again, read Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States. You can read them individually, but also I encourage people to read these things in study groups, book clubs, movement organizations. And then come up with a plan of action, and it's not good enough to just read W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, although you must read that book to understand the root of the problems we're facing now. But read it in a group, and I'm happy to, if you want me to Skype, if your listeners are in a town where they decide they want to do these things, Skype me in. I'm happy to join in and take part in a discussion. And then come up with a plan of action. That's the final thing I'll say, Alonzo, is studying is really important. Education is at the foundation. But as Dr. King told us over and over again, education without social action is meaningless. All it means is that you or I got enlightened individually by reading or studying something. But unless we use that to engage in some form of social action, then, we're kind of short-circuiting the process. And so... let's get together. Let's get organized.
I agree. Knowledge is demonstrated, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I would like to thank our guest, Dr. Paul Ortiz. Even though you're a Florida Gator, I'm a FSU alum. So
all right.
I still learned a lot from a Gator. But thanks again for being on the podcast, and I look forward to being in contact with you.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you again, Alonzo, for the wonderful work that you're doing, and thank you again for inviting me. It's been a real privilege and a lot of fun.
Good. Thank you.
Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed the content, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Stay up to date for more videos by clicking the bell notification icon and following our social media. For any of the people, groups, companies, or videos that were referenced in this video, don't forget to check the description and or the pinned comment section. The question lane, solving problems through the process of questions and answers.